seat, we're going to go ahead and get started with the first part of our program. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us this evening. My name is Emmy DeGrappa, and I am the Regional Director of the Wyoming Humanities Council. And we are in the business of convening conversations and critical thinking. And the humanities are what you do every day. So they are all the studies of psychology and sociology and literature and culture and history. And even if you were discussing your life purpose with your friend, that would be the humanities. It's everything that encompasses our human existence, why we do what we do. And so we like to put on programs like this that are free and open to the public. And we cannot do this without our sponsors. And we've had amazing sponsors for this series of programming that we've been doing that encourages us to include the Latino community, the non-English speaking part of our community, 30% of our community. And so we've tried to do programming that bring them together with our non-Latino community. And so far it has been very, very successful. And so I want to thank the American Library Association that sponsored this film, and we're going to just show an excerpt of it this evening. Just kind of a teaser to tee it up to show you 500 years of Latino history in the United States, the untold story. And you can actually go onto the American Library Association website or PBS and download this and watch all 6 components because they're very, very interesting. And then I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities that was also a funder of this program, St. John's Episcopal Church, the Wart Hotel, Silver Dollar Bar and Grill, and Latino Resource Center. So they were all major contributors in putting this program together. And Letty Lira and Isabel Zumel have been very instrumental in helping me. And she is doing simultaneous translation for anyone who speaks Spanish and needs that. And she's here this evening. But I especially want to thank our host for tonight, Jim Waldrop, who has been a big supporter and is going to introduce the rest of this program. Thanks, Jim. Oh, I have to say one more thing, or I'll get fired. See these stamped envelopes? This means that you can become a member of the Wyoming Humanities Council. You can take this home and you can put a check in it. We accept $1,000 bills. No, I'm just kidding. But any amount is so helpful to make these programs happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emmy, and thank you all for being here at the Wart Hotel and the Silver Dollar Bar and Grill. It is certainly my pleasure to have been involved over the course, I think, Emmy, of the last 6 months with the Cultural Diversity and Community Awareness Campaign, for which we are a major sponsor. Emmy, thank you for your great work and your insight and creating dialogue, important dialogue that's important for our community and important for our nation and beyond. So I appreciate Emmy and the Humanities Council for your great work. Hear, hear. I have the distinct honor tonight of introducing David Vela. David is a career veteran of the National Park Service. He began his tenure as Superintendent of Grand Teton National Park and the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Memorial Parkway in March of 2014. Prior to taking his current post, David was an Associate Director for Workforce, Relevancy, Inclusion in the National Park Service's Washington headquarters, where he oversaw programs including human resources, learning and development, equal opportunity, youth, and the Office of Relevancy, Diversity, and Inclusion. Before his time in Washington, David served for over 4 years as the director of the National Park Service's Southeast region, where he oversaw 66 national parks in 9 states, the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. David's a graduate of Texas A&M, which he will tell you all about. Just get to know him. He is a proud alumni of Texas A&M, as he should be. He's a graduate with a Bachelor of Science degree in Recreation and Parks. He graduated from the U.S. Department of the Interior's Senior Executive Service Candidate Development Program. Not sure what the acronym for that would be, but it's a big one. In May of 2006. He and his wife Melissa have 2 children, Christina and Anthony, and 4 lovely grandchildren. So all of that's terrific, but what's important for you to know is that David is not just a tremendous steward of this park that we call home here in Teton County. David is a passionate and strategic leader of the highest conviction. He's a mentor to so many, not only Latinos, but so many at the National Park Service, to his peers and employees throughout the nation, in this country, and already to so many in this community. David touches lives with his compassion, his sincerity, and his generosity. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce someone I'm proud to call my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, David Vela.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that very warm introduction. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. And Emmy, I want to thank you for the opportunity to join you in our community and having a conversation, a very important conversation on the role of Latinos, not only in our community, but in our nation. And Jim, thank you again. You know, Jim, when you talk about community servants, when Melissa and I first arrived to this amazing community, Jim was one of the first to openly embrace us, and this community as well. And he is a dear friend. As a member of the airport board and a member of this community, serving in so many different capacities, Jim really champions community, and he champions people. And I'm honored also to call Emmy and Jim a friend. And I see some friends in the audience too that I've come to know over the past couple of years. You know, my journey to this community began as a teenager in the 1960s. I come from a small community called Wharton County, which unfortunately has been in the news because of all the flooding recently outside Houston. But for some reason, my parents decided in the 1960s, and some of you have heard me tell this story, that we needed to go to Yellowstone. We'd never heard of Yellowstone. We never heard of what a national park was. It was not part of our upbringings. It was not part of our experience. So on the way to Yellowstone, the first national park that we stopped at was Grand Teton National Park. And I got to tell you, it's like falling in love for the first time. That's exactly what happened with me. I fell in love with this iconic landscape, the wildlife, but most importantly, this community. And I have the honor of sharing with you that I now serve, as Jim mentioned, as the 21st superintendent, going back to 1929 of Grand Teton National Park. It all started with that one experience. And now I have the blessing every morning with Melissa and I, my kindergarten classmate and high school sweetheart and bride of 36 years, to wake up to the Grand Teton every morning. It is indeed a blessing and an honor to have that experience. One trip, one experience changed my life. And I'm standing before you here today as a result of that. So what I'd like to do is, using this technology here, is to introduce briefly the members of our distinguished panel before we begin the film. So I'd like to introduce Luther Propst. Luther, where are you? There's Luther. Luther in the back. I'm just going to say just a brief word about our panelists, and as the film concludes, then we'll bring them up and we'll begin a hopefully a very productive and engaging dialogue. So Luther has been a friend of mine for many years. He's been advancing conservation and smart growth in the North American West since 1988. He's co-authored 3 books, including Balancing Nature and Commerce in Gateway Communities. Our second panelist is Desiree Ramirez. Where's Desiree? Desiree's there in the back. Desiree's passion in life is to work with historic collections, and she works for both Teton Science Schools and Grand Teton National Park as an archivist. Veronica Verdean. Veronica, where are you? There in the back. Veronica is a park ranger at Grand Teton National Park and performs education and media outreach in support of our nation's 100th birthday of the National Park Service and your national parks. And Tania Jimenez. Tania, raise your hand. Tania is a senior at Jackson Hole High School and is a member of our Pura Vida program. And we have some other members of our Pura Vida program, and we'll explain a little bit later what that program is all about. So without any further ado, let's watch the film. Okay, we'll ask our panelists to come up. Thanks, Emmy. That was pretty amazing. I remember when I was in Washington, I was asked to open the Mark Anthony concert at Wolf Trap for the Performing Arts, where they displayed. I wasn't a great opening act for Mark Anthony, but I'll tell you, but it was quite an honor to demonstrate some of the footage that talked about our Latino heritage, and it was quite fascinating. This film also brings back a lot of memories for me. For one, I grew up in a very small rural agricultural community of 10,000 people, and I remember, you know, the signs, and I remember a little bit of the antagonism that took place within the Latino community growing up in the 60s in Southeast Texas. But one of the things that I always remember was the advice and counsel that my parents gave me, and my brother and my sister. I'm the oldest of 11 grandkids. And that was to take pride in who we are as a people, as a culture, and as Americans. And I remember my dad telling me a story. My parents had high school educations. My dad is a PhD candidate, but in the 50s he was an honor student. And he was coming out of a Spanish class in the 1950s in a very small community, speaking Spanish. The principal happened to be outside the room, and his name is Ramon, but the principal called him Ray. He said, "Ray, what are you doing?" He said, "Nothing, sir, I'm just coming out of the Spanish class." He said, "Come to my office." My dad went to his office, and the principal proceeded to give him 3 licks for speaking Spanish coming out of a Spanish class. And my dad made a pledge at that very moment. It was a humiliating experience. But he pledged that all 3 of his children would be proficient in the English language above all things, and that they would get a college education no matter the cost. And we did. But we still maintained, even despite that horrific experience, the value and importance of our language and our culture and our heritage, where Spanish was spoken at home by my parents, by my grandparents. In fact, we had family in Monterrey, Mexico, and they would send us to Monterrey and Guadalajara to learn the correct Spanish. And so it was very much a part of my culture and upbringing. But those experiences were life-changing. And another memory that I had was when my dad was getting his master's degree at the University of Michigan in the 1970s. The farm worker movement was very active. And as fate would have it, my parents and my brother, sister, and I, we were all on the welfare rolls. And I'll never forget the first time that my mother took out the food stamps while we were at a checkout counter. And she gave me a life lesson that still serves me today about, son, we paid our taxes. There's nothing to be ashamed about. This is short term. This too shall pass. That was an experience, but also serving on the picket lines to picket and to boycott what the farm worker movement was. And I had the honor of seeing Cesar Chavez at a rally in Detroit, Michigan as a teenager. Cesar was not a very tall man in stature, but he was huge in passion and faith and love of community. And what I learned from Cesar Chavez as a teenager still serves me today as an adult and as an American. Cesar reminded us that we can be proud of who we are, but we can also speak our piece in mind. Because after all, we were talking about protecting humankind as we were working in the fields and picking and serving the tables of America. So that film brought back a lot of memories of what my dad went through, what we went through as kids, but most importantly, the life's lessons and the tremendous blessing of being an American from multiple heritages. So what I'd like to do is to ask each of the panelists to kind of explain a little bit, provide a little perspective of who they are, and a little bit about their Latino community. I will remind you of a quote that Mark Twain once said. He said, there are two things in life that we should be thankful for. The first is the fact that we were born, and the second was to find out why. So the first, why we were born, and the second, to find out why. I'll provide a little bit more perspective on my journey, but I want to give the panelists an opportunity to talk about, provide a little perspective of who they are, where they came from, and what does it mean to be Latino, Latina?
Hello, everybody. My name is Veronica Verdean. As David mentioned, I work for Grand Teton National Park with really lovely people in the Education and Outreach Division. I'm originally from East Los Angeles, California, a little place called El Sereno, if anyone is familiar with the area. Got one. And I just recently graduated college. I went to Bowdoin College in Maine. So my path to the park and sort of what being Latino means to me is it's a lot of different things. I'm multicultural. I identify most strongly with that, I think. It's funny, this week I told some people in passing, I'm going to be on a panel. It's about Latinos and their experience in the outdoors. And, I got a couple like, hey, do you mind me asking one question? But why? It's sort of, I think perception comes to mind a lot when I think of my experience. I feel sometimes so different in the different places that I'm in. Los Angeles, California, I feel right at home amongst, sort of my Mexican-American peers. Other places, it's sort of puzzling for other people. And it's interesting. I think identity sometimes, it's totally affected by who you are and who's around you. So it's an interesting journey, kind of continuing to explore that. But as my path to the parks and my connection to this panel is that I'm a park ranger now. I was taken to national parks when I was little by my parents. They kind of loaded us up. It was sort of like National Lampoon, except we were just kind of like multicultural misfits. And we got to see a lot of things, and so I credit my parents for sort of opening the door. We may have only spent 2 hours in a national park. We spent maybe 2 hours in Grand Teton, but I'm here now, living here, inviting my family and friends back. So it's been a really cool journey, but I'll pass it on for now.
I'm Desiree Ramirez. David introduced me earlier. I work in the archives for Grand Teton National Park as well as the Murie Center / Teton Science Schools. I first, got into the parks. My first museum job was through a multicultural Getty scholarship program. and I was able to work at Catalina Island with their museum. And if it hadn't been for this concept of multiculturalism that I didn't really understand growing up, I wouldn't have been able to hold the history in my hands and have that feeling of joy and excitement, and knowing that this piece of history has interacted with so many people over time, and I'm connected to it now. But yeah, I guess I jumped ahead a little bit, but I got my undergrad at Whittier in Southern California, so another Southern California person, and then got my master's degree in historical administration from Eastern Illinois University. And a personal story I wanted to share about being a Latina is when my parents grew up in the generation where their parents didn't want to teach them Spanish for the similar reason that David brought up. So as a result, I was never taught Spanish in my home. And I think that's a real challenge now, growing up as a Hispanic woman, and everyone assumes that I can speak Spanish, which is bad. I should. But always my response is, lo siento, no hablo español. But, so it's a unique experience. We have perceptions on what a Latino should be, and that isn't true. We're all different, but we can connect.
Great. I feel a little awkward. But David asked me to come and speak opposing diversity in the parks and to give the perspective of the baby boomer. He did not. No, but I'm really honored to be speaking and to provide the perspective of a white Anglo baby boomer. I was born and raised in North Carolina. I'm kind of torn because I'm repulsed by this recent law they passed, and yet my mother lives there and I'm going to visit her, and so we'll figure out something. But I was raised in a mill town, textiles, in a deeply racist community where racism just permeated everything. And it was kind of peculiar because it's something very different than the experience we have now, where in the town where I grew up, and my experience as a young person, there were two categories. You were white or you were black. And that was it. And it created an odd world, one that I was eager to leave. I was born in the wrong part of the country, and grew up with a love affair with the Western United States. To me, it was just, you know, and not the West in terms of the cowboy thing, but the mountains and the deserts and the canyons. And this was before the internet, and I remember a friend who moved to North Carolina from California, and I said, gosh, I really want to go out there and visit Yosemite National Park. How was a kid to know, right? So, but for me, and this is, I think, maybe relevant to the conversation, but for me, growing up in a community that was insular and a lot of alcohol abuse and drug abuse and whatnot, somehow I discovered the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And for me, visiting the park was an act of rebellion. It was an act of distancing myself from my parents, and distancing myself from a peer group that I was part of, but by necessity, and one that I didn't really feel that connected to. And it was odd because my parents discouraged me from taking weekend camping trips and wanted me to stay at home, and I wanted to explain to them that, look, I was behaving much healthier when I went to the Smokies, at least in terms of my liver health, than when I stayed around in Concord, North Carolina for the weekend. And so the parks were an act of rebellion and an act of rejection of what I was in, and I just loved the idea of moving out west, and I finally did so. And so I worked for 20-some years as the founder and executive director of the Sonoran Institute. We worked all over the West, helping to create locally based, community-based, collaborative solutions to conservation problems. That's how I got to know David, working at the international affairs programs down there between the U.S. and Mexico, and working on all these border parks, and some fun times. We should go out and have a beer and talk about that afterwards. And done a lot of work in northern Mexico, in the delta of the Colorado River, around Mexicali and other places, and since leaving Sonoran, kind of backing away a little bit from the land use planning aspects, I'm working now in a variety of contexts. I'm on the board of a foundation that makes grants, and we're trying to figure out what's important to me now is how do we remove the barriers, how do we remove the obstacles to making sure that, as Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell said in a major speech yesterday, how can we make it so that everyone has an equal chance to get outdoors? That's something that really motivates me, because that ability to get outdoors when I was in high school, I think saved me. I don't know that I would have a liver at this point if I had just stayed in Concord. And it has been very important in my life, and I think it's something that everybody, regardless of background, regardless of economic condition, needs to have that, deserves that opportunity to know what it's like to camp under the stars and to watch the sun come up and to spend the day hiking or whatever the case may be. So thank you.
Well said. And I think that what we're about to talk about, I think you can relate to any community of color, from Asian community, American Indian community, African American community. But I want to talk briefly about the power of stories. And that's exactly what we just saw on the video. We saw a history that goes back 500 years that talks about the first and continuous European settlement community in San Agustin, Florida. In fact, my wife would be here tonight, but she's actually in San Agustin, Florida, babysitting our 5th grandchild, so she couldn't be here tonight. But I see some members of my staff and my leadership team that are in the audience, and many of them are wearing this name tag, so at the end of the program, feel free to say hi to them and get to know them as well. We also have Alfonso Orozco, who's a National Park Service Academy graduate that's with us here tonight. Alfonso, where are you? Thanks for joining us. Get to know these folks, and they'll be glad to share their stories and what they're doing at Grand Teton National Park. But I want to tell you a quick story about the value of stories. In the mid-1800s, 1980s, boy, I'm dating. I'm not that old. That was a long time ago. Thanks, sister. That was a long time ago. But around 1984, I was a chief ranger at Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. This is audience participation time. So, anyone know, except for Park Service folks in attendance, anybody know what happened at Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park?
It's not fair for me.
It's not fair for you. Yes, sir.
That's where the Civil War ended.
That's exactly right. Do you happen to know where? I didn't know this as the chief ranger till I got there. Do you know where it took place in Appomattox Courthouse? At the courthouse? That's exactly what I thought. It's exactly what I thought. Who said courthouse? Absolutely. So I'm thinking, like every other American, that I'm going to go in on the first day. I'm going to go into the courthouse, and I'm going to see a table, and there'll be 2 chairs where Lee sat and where Grant sat. Not quite. To my astonishment, back in the day in Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, they name a lot of the villages after the village. So it was the village or the town of Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender actually took place in the McLean house, in the home of Wilmer McLean. Now, I would ask you to Google Wilmer McLean or to find out more about his story. Is fascinating. After the shots, either before or after, immediately around that time at Fort Sumter, the Battle of Bull Run took place literally in his backyard. And he said, this ain't gonna happen. This ain't gonna work. I'm moving. 4 years later, it ends in his parlor. It's a fascinating story. So as I was one day providing relief for one of my rangers for break or lunch, I was reading the story of Eli Parker, Colonel Eli Parker. Colonel Eli Parker, and this was fascinating, was an American Indian chief, and he was General Grant's aide-de-camp. What a lot of people don't know, you don't read this in history books, but this is where, when I mentioned every community can find relevance in what we're talking about, Colonel Eli Parker was not only in the parlor, and not only was he an eyewitness to history, Colonel Eli Parker drafted the surrender terms that Robert E. Lee signed. This is an American Indian. How many members of that community around the country know that one of their ancestors was a witness and participant to history? Stories have power and meaning. So I began to ask myself, well, what role did my Latino community play? Because I don't remember reading anything in the history books about Latino history during the Civil War. 20 years later, as regional director, we commissioned this book. It was the first book ever done by the National Park Service. It is called Hispanics in the Civil War from Battlefield to Homefront. And you know what I found, my friends? 20,000 of my ancestors fought in the Civil War on the battlefield and on the home front. That my ancestors, some of my ancestors were plantation owners and owned slaves, Latinos. Plantation owners and owned slaves, had no clue. That the first Medal of Honor recipient was a Union soldier that fought at the Battle of Gettysburg during Pickett's charge. And he was a flag bearer, so he carried his company's flag, which was a high honor. But what happened if you were a flag bearer during the Civil War? You were the first to get shot. So it was quite an honor, but short-lived, unfortunately, if you had that distinction. Well, unbeknownst to his commanding officer, he decided to go into the field of battle, seize the Confederate battle flag, went back to his commanding officer, gave the flag to his commanding officer without saying a single word. He became the first Medal of Honor recipient as a Latino. Now, why is that important? Well, my son had the honor of being baptized by a Green Beret Medal of Honor recipient. In fact, I was in the courtyard of the Pentagon where I saw President Reagan bestow our nation's highest honor around his neck. Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavides received the Congressional Honor, Medal of Honor for his actions in Vietnam as a Green Beret. He baptized my son. And so my son can now read about the first Medal of Honor recipient and know about his padrino. Stories have meaning and have significance. They not only teach us and tell us who we are as Latinos, as African Americans, and as Americans as a whole, but they may help to provide some sense of purpose for where we may want to go as a community, as Latinos. And for the first time in Indian country, Indian school kids are learning about Eli Parker and are learning about that Union soldier and that 20,000 of our ancestors fought in the Civil War. There are many other examples of other periods of American history where Latinos have played a role and continue to play a role in American society and American history. So let's talk about that. So I'll ask our panelists as to their thoughts and perspectives about the power of story, and if they have any stories that they want to share and convey to the audience. But what does stories mean to you, whether it's family history or whether it's community history or Latino history in general? And anyone can take that first question. Go ahead.
Sure. Well,
Power of story.
yeah, I mean, I think that stories are so powerful, and kind of I've heard that story twice now, maybe, but no, all good thing. But it always reminds me of something that happened to me when I was going to college. My family came out to Maine with me, my dad, brother, and my mom, and we were sitting at, we picked it's called Joshua's Tavern. It's like the local college bar in Brunswick, Maine. And we sat underneath a table, and there was a life preserver, and it said USS Obregon. And my dad started laughing, and we didn't really know what was happening. But he told us that Obregon was from East Los Angeles, from the same. I think he was from City Terrace, California, which is where my dad grew up. And he was, I think, a Purple Heart recipient. and he died saving, you know, like one of his fellow soldiers. And in East LA, a couple, like in the 1960s, they were gonna build a theater in City Terrace, and they were searching for someone, some kind of local, to kind of embody and to name that theater after. And they had Obregon right there. And yet they decided that they didn't really want to name the theater after a Mexican American. And instead, they named him, I don't know, after some random person from, I think, like the East Coast or something. They decided to name this theater, and a couple years later it burned down. And so my dad was telling us that story is, you know, look at that. Here we are in Brunswick, Maine. You know, at the time that was sort of a crazy decision. I'm from Los Angeles. You know, people still ask me, why'd you go to school in Maine? Still don't really have an answer. It was a great time, but you know, it was pretty neat because every time I went to Joshua's Tavern, I thought of that story and that moment with my family. And it was really neat to not be the only Mexican from East LA in Brunswick, Maine. So stories, you know, they just bring back so many memories, and I think they can really, you know, just sort of empower you and make you not feel so alone.
That's well said, and while the next panelist is thinking about their remarks, audience participation. So, who once said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead"? Have you ever heard of that quote, that saying? Any guesses of who may have said that? It blew me away. I had no clue when I found out who the author of that was. Any guesses? It's a hard one, I'll admit. The person that said that was Admiral David Farragut. But when you go to Washington, D.C., and we go to the metro station, you go to Farragut Station. It's Farragut. I'll tell you about this guy. So his father was from Spain, and Farragut was the first Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, and Admiral in the United States Navy. He was Latino. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead was said by a Latino. Had no clue. That's fascinating. Next panelist. It is great. It blew me away.
So I've worked in museums and archives for 6-7 years now, from California to Washington, D.C., to Yosemite, to Rocky Mountain, and now here. And everything I interact with has a story. But it's interesting because when we were talking about this panel discussion, I was trying to think of examples in the various collections I've worked with where Latino histories were prominent, and they're not. At least from my experience, it's an untold story, and I think that's why putting together that video and having discussions about the culture is really important. But a good example of a story, I always think of the Muries, the Murie family, if you guys know about them. If you don't, come talk to me later. But their collection is amazing. My favorite part of it is to look through Marty's speeches and read about how she felt in this community and how she connected to the ecosystem and to the participants in it, and also when they would go to Alaska and meet the native people there, and they fell in love. I mean, there's photos in various Murie collections throughout the country of them with the native people and feasting and smiling and laughing and dancing and connecting. And I think that's what I always come back to, is just that idea that we can all connect regardless of the heritage.
Absolutely, that's well said. Luther, you've been in the conservation community for many years, and what's your advice, and how do you engage and provide for an inclusive community in pursuing that movement? So whether it's stories, whether it's engagement, how do you provide a big tent to welcome folks into the conservation community that you've been a leader in for so many years?
Yeah, thank you. First, and I'll segue, but regarding stories, I think, David, you make a very important point. I think as a species, we make decisions based upon stories. we make decisions based upon a narrative, and then we use our neocortex, our rational brain, to justify what we decide based upon stories. Everybody loves stories, and one of the advantages of the national parks is, and I think it's an essential part, is the storytelling, and it brings me to something I'm very proud of, is that I played a small part in expanding Tumakakari, which I'm sure you can pronounce better than I can.
That's good.
Tumakakari National Historic Park. Tumakakari was the, help me here, it's the first Spanish mission, Jesuit mission in what is now the United States. It's between Tucson and Nogales in southern Arizona, and it was established as a national monument by Teddy Roosevelt, using the power of the Antiquities Act, a power that we hope isn't ever stripped from the president's arsenal of tools, quiver of tools. But Tumakakari, when I first moved to southern Arizona, was an abandoned church, period. 50 acres. It was a archaeological site, essentially. It was a church that was just stabilized and left there. And there was no story connected to it. It just seemed like a building. And I was very happy that the National Park Service in 2002, this was bipartisan by Ed Pastor and Jim Colby, the Democrat and Republican congressman that worked together at the time, worked to expand the park to pick up another 310 acres, and by doing so added the story. They added to the park the orchards. They added to the park the acequia, the irrigation canals from the Santa Cruz River, where people could draw water out of the river and have the life there. They added to the story not just the building of the church, but the archaeological sites that were the homes. And so they've made that park into a place where instead of going and walking through an empty building that really was kind of, I don't want to criticize the old version of it, but it was a kind of disembodied building, to the interpretation of a community that includes the river, so that people can not just go and walk through, but they can go down to the river, and kids can play and they can wade, and you can get a sense of what life was like. And that makes all the difference in the world. And I think that, and now Tumakakari, I think, is a much, much more, just an effective park. It tells a story. And it's not just an archaeological, or I might have said archaeological, I meant architectural site. It's not just an architectural site, but there's a story of what life was like in that part of the world that you couldn't have conveyed otherwise. And so it's that connection that really matters. And I think that's at the key to the conservation community being the conservation community working on diversity and inclusion issues. I'm frankly quite worried about the conservation community. I've gotten in a lot of trouble with conservation friends. You know, the average age 20 years ago of a member of a, kind of a national conservation group was about 49. The Nature Conservancy, the National Audubon Society, National Parks Conservation Association. 10 years ago, the average age was, guess? 59. What is it today?
69.
Okay, what does that tell you about the future? Right, figure that one out. So if these organizations don't recreate themselves, and some are, I'm delighted to see the number of organizations that are saying we need to make a leap and not just hire somebody young, but actually become a different kind of organization. But these organizations are growing older. They are even more one-dimensional, even more male, even more white, even more baby boomer generation than the users of the parks. So there's something that has to really change there, because my concern is that it's easy to confuse efforts that are needed to protect the natural and cultural resources with efforts to just protect the way it was when I was a kid. My parents wouldn't, because my father spent the early 40s in the Pacific Ocean, and not in the ocean, in the South Pacific, on boats and on islands, and came back and said, I ain't never sleeping in a tent again. So that was out of the picture. But when I was a kid, Mission 66 had made the parks accessible. they had designed them for that kind of Leave It to Beaver fantasy world where every male was an executive with General Motors, every female was a stay-at-home mom or housewife, and each family had 2.2 kids, and they loaded the kids in the station wagon and visited the parks. And so we have to accept the fact that change is a constant, and change is good. Evolution is important, and that the way we visit parks in the future may not be the same way we visited parks when I was a kid, but that's not necessarily bad. If it's bad for the resource, that's a different thing, but if it just means that maybe you have a bigger campsite for an extended family instead of the 2.2 kids, that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just different. So that's something that I think the conservation movement is beginning to embrace, and some groups have done more than others. I just love Stacy Barr at Sierra Club, for example, who's kind of the next generation. And many groups are moving that way, but we have to distinguish between what's just different from the 50s and what's not in the interest of the parks. And the problem is, because our society had such an excess of money, not an excess, but had plenty of money, let's say from 56 to 66, we invested hugely in Mission 66 when the Park Service built visitor centers, parkways, campgrounds, picnic areas, and they did so in a way that was appropriate for that time, at least the kind of fantasy world that we lived in at that time, and that benefited the people who came home from the war and were eligible for the GI Bill. And my parents probably more than yours, even though yours did okay from what I could tell, but I certainly know in the town I grew up in, the black veterans weren't eligible for the GI Bill. They were excluded. They were excluded from low interest loans. They were screwed. And so, we had the visitation of the park that was skewed toward those that were able to afford to do so. And so it's kind of like the park infrastructure is a bit, I don't want to say frozen, but it's a bit frozen in that area. And so, we have to think about the fact that maybe what's necessary now is going to be a little different.
Oh, that's well said. That's a great lead-in to the next question, and that is, how do we make the National Park Service, your national parks, relevant for a second century of service? That's a critical question. I get that question asked a lot. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and because you're right, Luther, we've made no bones about it, that at Grand Teton National Park, we're going after the kids, for all the reasons that you talked about. And it doesn't matter what their economic background, what their ethnicity is, it doesn't matter. We want and need that next generation of stewards and conservation advocates and park employees. And we have a program that's helping us to achieve that, and it's called Pura Vida. And I want to ask Tania Jimenez to come up and provide some perspectives of how Grand Teton National Park is striving to make itself relevant to the Latino community here in Jackson. I want to share too something that has stayed with me I've been in the service close to 30 years. I was at a conference, a national conference. We were talking about diversity. How can we get communities of color interested in coming to their national parks? Which, let's be clear, national parks are part of all of our collective birthright, right? They belong to all of us. And I'll never forget what an African American told me. He said, Dave, I'm gonna shoot straight with you, bro. He said, bottom line is, when my ancestors went into the woods back in the day, they didn't always come out. How do I overcome that? That's powerful. That his ancestors went into the woods and didn't always come out. How could we deal with that DNA, with that mindset that's been institutionalized generation after generation, that national parks, one, are safe, that they're part of your birthright, and they're yours to enjoy. So, with that said, let's turn to our Pura Vida students and get their perspectives. It's on.
Hello, my name is Tania. I am part of the Pura Vida internship during the spring and during the summer. It's just a camp. And I started doing this the very first year that they did this, and it was a truly life-changing experience because I visited places in the park that I'd never been to, and I took groups of my family and groups of other Latinos around the community who hadn't visited different parts of the park, such as the Murie Center. I didn't even know that existed, and because of programs like these, I was able to explore these new environments, I guess.
Can I ask you before you turn the mic over, so was there a reason why you or your family had not visited Grand Teton National Park?
Well, we'd visited places such as like String Lake, Jenny Lake, and all those other places, but I guess we hadn't gone out to explore other different places, such as the Murie Center, like I said before. And I don't know, I guess we didn't have time to do them, or we didn't make time. We weren't sure what there was to do out in the park, most of all, so that was basically it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Montiel. I am a senior at Jackson Hole High School, and I am a member of the Pura Vida internship. That's one of the best programs I've attended to because, like Tanya said, they take you to every corner of the park and it's free. And you get to interact with a group of kids that you might not talk to at school. You might see them, but you might not talk to them. And together you and your friends lead a group of family through the park. And some of these families have never been to the park, even though they live in Teton community. And it always amazes me how, like my parents, for example, have been here 20 years and they've been to the park maybe like 5 times. And I always like taking them because I feel like this park belongs to everyone, not just whoever they think it belongs to. And I just want to make a difference and bring more Latinos to the park.
That's awesome. If you were to provide any advice to a Latino in the community about Grand Teton, about Yellowstone, about national parks in general, what would that be?
Probably be informed. Sometimes we don't have enough information, or sometimes we think the wrong things, and that prevents us from going to the park. So I think just being informed is enough.
Awesome. Well done. Thank you. I'm going to put Alfonso on the spot. Alfonso, come up here. He didn't know this was going to happen, but you know, there are a number of, when we talk about engagement, it's not only about exactly what the Pura Vida participants said, about feeling safe and knowing that this is part of their birthright. It's actually more than that. It's also about hopefully preparing the next generation of our workforce in the National Park Service. So if we're telling Latino stories and the stories of America, and we're providing engagement opportunities for them to feel safe and welcomed in their national parks, then the next step would be employment. And what I want Alfonso to talk about briefly is that side of your experiences at Grand Teton and what the program, the National Park Service Academy, meant to you and means to you.
Sure, yeah. So I'm originally from Oakland, California. Didn't grow up going to the outdoors a whole lot. I remember going on a camping trip once when I was maybe like 14 years old, and it was in Fresno, and we didn't bring sleeping bags. We brought a tent, but we brought our regular blankets, and we froze our butts off that night. But I had the best time of my life, and I always kind of thought back to that experience and thought about how I could do that more in the future, because we really relied on friends or other family members who would do that. We didn't really know how to do that. But then I got to college and I took an outdoor leadership class, and my instructor was an outward bound instructor, and he kept telling us about leadership through the lens of all of these backpacking trips that he had led. And I'm like, wait a minute, what's backpacking? What is that? How can I do that, right? And so I was sitting there thinking about how I could learn how to backpack, how to learn about the gear. And there's this poster to my left side. It's for this organization called Bay Area Wilderness Training, nonprofit in the Bay Area, who trains teachers how to get kids outdoors and then provides free gear for them, free gear rental, to take the kids outdoors. And so I learned how to backpack. I did my first backpacking trip in Yosemite National Park. I took my family out. I took any friends who were even remotely interested. And through them, I found out about the National Park Service Academy. So I came to Grand Teton National Park in 2013 during the spring. Still a lot of snow. I didn't really know exactly what I was getting myself into coming out here, but they said we'll pay for you to come out to Grand Teton National Park and see the beautiful mountains during spring break. So I took that risk and I came out here, and it was a life-changing experience. My career track just changed, and as I left this week knowing exactly where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do, and that was to work with the national parks, to work in the national parks. And since then, after the NPS Academy, I went to Yellowstone National Park, worked with the Youth Conservation Corps there. Went back to Oakland to finish my undergrad at San Francisco State University, and I wanted to continue to work for the Park Service. And luckily, we have a really amazing park unit out there. I did interpretation on Alcatraz Island, got my first seasonal job as an interpreter on Alcatraz Island. And after that season was over, I got my first permanent job with the National Park Service. Pretty interesting location, Virgin Islands National Park. Then I got the opportunity to come back to Grand Teton National Park to do a master's. So now I'm with Teton Science Schools here in Grand Teton National Park. And I'll put in a plug-in real quick for Latino Outdoors, just kind of getting that started. We had our first event on April 16th. We had 17 participants. 5 families came out, and we led a hike in Grand Teton National Park with the support of Teton Science Schools and the National Park Service. So that's, yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that perspective. So in the few minutes we have left, I'd like to turn the mic over to the audience, to you, and to see if you have any questions of any of our panelists, and then I'm going to leave you with 2 closing thoughts. So any questions from the audience? Emmy.
Okay. When I was talking to Veronica, she had a really fun story that I wanted her to share. That
Which one?
about how different it was for your family, for you to have a job in the national park. Like that really wasn't part of your culture, part of your experience, and it was something so different that they really couldn't relate to what you were doing. They're like, why would you go live in the wilderness? Like, why would you do that?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so I've had these conversations with many people in this room. But yeah, it's a big, I think there are a lot of cultural differences within, what's perceived to be the outdoor community, the National Park Service. And there are some challenges, I think, as a student, as a millennial, as a person of color, who chooses to kind of go out and try and work in the outdoor, sort of the outdoor like industry, I guess. And I'm pretty lucky. I have the support of my immediate family. They're the ones that kind of drug me out for 2 weeks at a time, and we'd hit as many parks as possible and just try and see them. Never went camping, never really hiked, but we saw them, and that sort of plants a seed that I learned to explore later. But a lot of my extended family, kind of look at me quizzically, and they're like, "Why are you in the wilderness? What do you mean you don't have internet? Do you even get cell phone service? Why would you live there?" And it's been pretty tough, kind of convincing them, and it's this kind of tightrope that you have to walk. Making it seem appealing, although that doesn't always help. And just sort of sticking true to yourself and reminding yourself that it's something that is worthwhile and meaningful and passionate to yourself. But I kind of had some successes. I also did the NPS Academy and was an intern at Zion National Park the summer before my senior year of college. And I had been talking about Zion. I had worked there the summer prior to that, and my extended family on my dad's side wanted to have a big reunion, and I sort of convinced them to have it in Zion National Park. So we have this big, huge group of like loud Mexican Americans coming into Zion, like wreaking havoc, like someone broke their arm. It was fantastic. And it really wouldn't have happened that way. They wouldn't have visited the park had it not been for me working there and talking about it incessantly. You know, and my grandfather, who, you know, he came here, you know, as a teenager from Mexico, and, you know, I always kind of give him flack for it because he, you know, he's always like, Veronica, why do you have to go so far away? Like, you have everything here in Los Angeles, and he gives me so much flack for it. And I kind of have to turn it around and tell him, Grandpa, you left your home, you left everything you knew to come to America. You know, it's a way of finding your own path. You know, and I got him out to Zion, and he finally said, I understand why you like it out here. So I'm still trying to get my grandpa here this summer. We'll see how it goes. But I mean, I think echoing kind of what everyone else has said, I mean, when you get one individual going out, you know, us park rangers, we can't be in every home, we can't be in every family's car, you know, facilitating this wonderful experience. It turns to students and it turns to us to kind of be those experts for our families. And in that way, you know, the effect sort of multiplies. You get these tiny experts advocating the national parks and what great experiences you can have. So it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's worthwhile.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, sir.
David, barriers to entry. You talked about cultural as a barrier. A couple of years ago, you told me the uniforms in the Park Service actually can serve as a barrier. I've heard one guy over here talking about access to equipment, the fact that I was given equipment, and that allowed me to do it. In some cases, it may be the cost of entrance. What are the barriers, though, that prevent the Latino community from embracing the parks the way they should?
Anybody have any thoughts? I have a quick thought, but go ahead. Yeah, Alfonso.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So the event that I did on Saturday, we had, like I said, 5 families out there. I try to make an opportunity to speak with all of them and see how often they got out into the park, and if they didn't, you know, why. And one of the families said, you know, Alfonso, if we were able to know more about the culture inside of the park and what exactly the regulations are, she's like, we just don't know. She's like, he told me, I have a cousin in Salt Lake City who went to this lake, and apparently you weren't supposed to get into the lake, but she took off her shoes and she went into the lake and she got a ticket. She's like, I don't want that. And I see someone over there shaking their head, and it could be true, but it could also be perceived, right? It could also be this perception that inside of the park there are different regulations, and we might get in trouble if we don't know what they are. I told them this really good story about how my parents, when they first came from Mexico, they went to our local regional park and they cut down a Christmas tree, and then they brought it home and, you know, they decorated it and all that.
They just borrowed it.
They just borrowed it. Yeah. But yeah, that's a big one. I think that's a pretty big barrier. I don't know if anyone else has something else.
I'd just say quickly, a barrier that we often overlook is just accessibility and proximity. In the Western United States, 85% of the population is urban, and we did have a very notable period of adding urban parks in the 70s, like Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. But you know what? Most of those, they're in the upper income white neighborhoods by and large. And so we have to create not just, minor parks, but there's opportunities to do better. The Los Angeles area, I was so proud that the Obama administration in 2014 designated San Gabriel Mountains National Monument. Now that's BLM, it's not park. Can I talk about that? Sure. But you know, it's a large area that's now protected, better interpreted, better accessed, that makes it so that you don't have to drive all day to get to a natural area. So a lot of it is just proximity and physical accessibility.
Well said. Go ahead, comment over here.
I was thinking of language barriers a couple weeks ago. We worked with Millie, the park ranger, to translate different brochures kind of things. And so I think that's a huge barrier, as well as time, like I said before. And I guess families just need to make more time, and also I guess fear of what's out there, like whether it may be animals or like transportation or different things like that. Absolutely.
And even something as simple as the National Park Service uniform. We were the first rangers to open up the missions in San Antonio in the late 1970s. And I remember us being confused with La Migra, ahí viene La Migra. Here comes immigration, border patrol. No. Our uniforms were very comparable. And after explaining and the mission communities, that we weren't immigration, we were guardaderos de parque, we were park rangers. We were able to turn the tide. So there's so many different issues and great comments and perspectives. So we're right at time, but I'd like to leave you with two questions. And I think it's relevant to the conversation we've had tonight. The first question is, how can American Latino heritage be better integrated into the story of America? These stories aren't necessarily unique, they're American stories. We are Americans with a very proud, all of us in this room have a proud ethnicity and heritage that needs to be known and celebrated. Latino community is part of that. So how best do we integrate the Latino story as part of America's story? And what in this great 500-year story of American Latino heritage is still not told, is still not known? There's a lot of story still out there that we have yet to discover. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as part of the American story to get to know who said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," among many other storylines. And in the process, how do we honor it in all of its breadth and with the participation of the Latino community and the citizens of our great nation? It is a shared story. It is a shared history and heritage that we all are a part of. My friends, how about a hand for our panelists for a great job, for Emmy, and for you for being here. So Emmy, we'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, I handed out the evaluation forms, and it's really important that you fill them out. And if you want to learn about the next program, which is May 18th, and you want to put that on your calendar, it's about education and raising your child with pride in education. So I think, and that's Latino, raising a Latino child with pride in education. And we're going to have Letty as our translator, so we want to invite the Latino community again. We always want to make an integrated conversation between the non-Latino community and the Latino community. And we want to hear all of your perspectives, which is why it's really important for you to fill out the evaluation card. Tell us what are the subjects and topics that you want to talk about, because that is what the Wyoming Humanities Council is all about. And so we thank you today for attending this program, and we hope you learned something, and we hope you have something to take away. So thank you so much, and thank you again.